Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Trauma Informed Church Kid Podcast. Today and every day, we are reconstructing religion for the hurting with theology that doesn't hurt. To quote Monty Python, and now for something completely different. This will be our first How of Hurt episode of Season 2. In this one, we're going to take a look at what trauma is, look at its definitions, symptoms, and also the kinds of trauma that are out there. And all of this with our goal throughout the whole season to understand trauma better, to hopefully unlearn the lessons of trauma, to build resilience to further trauma, and to find a way to not only survive, but to thrive. These are very important episodes for me, not only because this is my field of expertise and study, but also because I chose this field for a reason. It is very close to my heart. Now, I will certainly give a bit of a content warning at the outset. As we cover these episodes, including this one, we will be discussing trauma and its effects, including suicide. Now, of course, I will obviously avoid the gory details, but I will be frank and honest. And if this is something that causes significant distress for you, consider listening with a trusted friend or partner, or exposing yourself to it within a therapeutic context. And as I say that, you'll notice that I don't call this a trigger warning or tell you to avoid it, because avoidance of feared stimuli only increases fear of the stimuli. With my clients, I refuse to talk about avoiding triggers. Instead, we talk about resourcing ourselves when triggered and developing a careful and wise path through the trauma response. We are not either in my counseling office or here trying to create safe spaces. We are trying to create brave spaces. My goal here and there is to accept, then embrace, and perhaps even rejoice in suffering as a means toward healing and recovery. But that is a very deeply pastoral and personal level issue. So hence, a general heads up and an encouragement to resource yourself as you can. And of course, in light of that, I do want to offer a disclaimer at the outset. The contents of this podcast are for informational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional medical or psychological advice, diagnosis, or treatment. This podcast does not provide personalized advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health professional if you feel that you are in crisis. And if you look in the show notes, I will be providing some links to some community resources that you can access. And the reason why I need to be able to approach this from a very generic, high-level standpoint is because the chances are very high that someone listening has experienced trauma. 50% of U.S. adults experience a traumatic event in their lifetime. And worldwide, that number goes up to 70%. Around 42% of those events are intimate partner sexual violence. And all the way on the other end of the spectrum, we have adverse childhood experiences. In the United States, 80% of adolescents have reported that they have experienced at least one of these adverse childhood experiences. 22% of adolescents say they have experienced 4 or more. Now, out of these huge numbers, it is true that only 6% will develop a diagnosis of PTSD. Now, that might seem small. However, we need to take into account that that is just over 2 million people in the United States. And we also need to account for the fact that PTSD is the most serious version of a trauma response. 20% of the people who have experienced traumatic events in their lifetime will develop something called acute stress disorder, which is something like stage 1 PTSD. The other thing we have to keep in mind of that 6% figure is that is just the diagnoses. Not only is it only adults, which is not counting how many children will grow into a PTSD response, it also, sadly, does not account for how many people have died without a PTSD diagnosis. Because there is a significant correlation between PTSD and increased suicide risk. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for ages 10 to 34 in the United States, and the fourth leading cause of death in ages 35 through 44. In fact, suicide claims twice as many lives as there are homicides in the United States. Now, thankfully, there is a lot of awareness and better understanding of trauma now. Previously, the message was, man up, suck it up. It's only something that happens to fragile or weak people or people looking for attention. Having said that, though, there is still a lot of skepticism and stigma. Both skepticism about just the bare validity of trauma as a real thing, but also of PTSD as a diagnosis. And of course, on the other end of the spectrum, we have the TikTok and social media culture where we find people claiming trauma without any sort of official diagnosis. I myself work in a heavily military impacted community, and I have been paneled with TRICARE in the past. And one of the things I have seen is that within the military, there is absolutely a sense of if I seek out help for these issues, it will affect my ability for promotion and it will affect my ability to work within the military culture. And so as a result, I have had many TRICARE affiliated service members decline to use their TRICARE so that it will not come back to their chain of command. So as a result of all of this, my hope in these episodes is to help shed some light on some of these important issues. But that's just the beginning of the journey. As I said last episode, knowledge is not healing. It is a path that you must walk with someone who can carry your burdens with you. To enter into the valley of the shadow of death with you in such a way that you feel safe and secure. To hopefully find resurrection on the other side of that valley of death, whether that death is deconstruction of religion or deconstruction of hope after trauma. So enough talking about trauma. What is it? Peter Levine, the founder of somatic experiencing, has noted that trauma has two major features. Number one, a perception of a life-altering threat. And number two, the inability to deal with that threat. In one of his books, he says this, quote, "Trauma is trauma, no matter what causes it," end quote. What that means is that to define trauma is a highly subjective assessment. There is no blood test. There are no standardized hormonal levels we can test against a control group. And frankly, it's very similar to just physical pain in this regard. Just because two people have the same injury and one person is in pain and the other is not, doesn't mean that their pain isn't real, or that pain or chronic pain disorders aren't real, or that the people are just faking it or getting attention or trying to feel special. Now, granted, some perhaps are, but it would be an egregious mistake to presume guilt in such cases. We simply do not have the subjective data. We can only make that assessment after long periods of observation and personal interaction. So just to continue defining trauma a bit for us. Trauma is something that occurs on a spectrum. I usually, with my clients, will call it from capital T to lowercase t. Now, these are all still called trauma because the effects are the same. They differ in intensity, frequency, and duration, but not in kind. And all it takes for trauma to be present are those two factors, the perception of threat and the inability to cope with that threat. Now, some people wonder if there is a difference between abuse and trauma. Now, I want to be clear here. When I'm speaking using the wisdom of the field, I will clarify that. When I'm speaking out of my own head, as I am now, I'm going to be clear on that too. The way that I contextualize the difference between abuse and trauma is that abuse is trauma that is perpetuated from within an overt power dynamic. That could look like relational abuse, everything from bullying to intimate partner violence, or perhaps familial abuse, where there's a power dynamic between a parent and a child, or between a husband and a wife. There also can be institutional abuse, where larger systems create power differentials that take things from the realm of trauma to abuse. And that's also what we see in the case of religious abuse, where you can experience trauma and traumatic events at the hands of many different people within the church, but it really only is the people who are at the top or the system itself that are able to perpetrate religious abuse. Here's the shorthand. Trauma does not require power dynamics. Abuse, however, does. Trauma is about events and individuals. Abuse is about systems and communities. Finally, there is one last clarification definition I want to offer, and that is between hurt and harm. And this is a question that one of the people on the Facebook discussion group raised at the very beginning of season 1 of the podcast, which I think was a very good question. In the tagline of this podcast, I say, theology that doesn't hurt. Even the title of these episodes is The How of Hurt. And it raises the question, isn't it true that hurt can be a good thing or desirable? Isn't it true that sometimes we have to cause hurt for someone's good? Now, of course, that could easily be taken advantage of, but it is true. Merely causing pain is not doing evil. And I will be honest, I admit my language is imprecise in those formulations just cited above. Ultimately, I will admit that I have sacrificed precision for pithiness. Well, I do want to provide clarity now, in order to not sacrifice clarity as well. There is a bit of a spectrum here too, that goes from hurt to wounding to harm. Sort of like a physical injury. We'll use that analogy again. If I sprain my wrist, that's hurt. If I have broken my wrist, that's wounding. If I have injured my wrist to the extent that I have lifelong limitations or serious restrictions being placed on my mobility and usage of the limb in the future, that is what harm looks like. Now, all three of those, hurt, wounding, and harm, they all cause pain. But not all of them have the same depth of effects. They all still require treatment, everything from a simple brace and a change of activity, all the way to surgery and even possible amputation. The point of all of this and all these definitions is that trauma is variable, complex, and subjective. It can come from any source. It can affect anyone. People may be resilient in one area of life and extremely vulnerable in another. An evaluation of trauma can only come from a deeply intimate and personal relationship, such as, for example, a therapist and a client. This is more than just simply what happened, because there is no objective measure of what reactions are valid and which ones are not. There is no foundation for saying any event was, quote, not enough to be able to rise to the level of trauma. And the reason for all of that is not just because I am a thoroughgoing postmodern who hates objective reality. It's because there is a tangled web of personal and environmental factors that determine if an event is just unpleasant or traumatic. So what is it that distinguishes unpleasant experiences from trauma? I submit that our primary indicator there is in the symptoms of trauma, specifically in their frequency, intensity, and duration. Here are some categories of some of the reactions that people experience when they experience a genuinely traumatic event or series of events. The first category is intrusion, where we see recurrent, involuntary, and distressing reliving of the event or events. That reliving could come through intrusive thoughts, through persistent dreams, through memories that will not go away and seem to go into grotesque detail despite the person not wanting them to. We also see that intrusion in the case of associational cues or stimuli. Those are things that are loosely associated with the event, such as a sound that mimics or is somewhat related to a gunshot. And when that stimuli occurs, the association within the brain causes a reaction that is out of proportion to the actual stimuli itself. One other way that we see intrusion happen within trauma is in active efforts to avoid, such as triggers that intrude upon daily life and make daily life very, very difficult. The other category that we see is dissociation. That's where we see examples of events such as flashbacks, where a person feels as if, even though my body is here in Colorado, my mind is in Fallujah. We also see dissociation with depersonalization. That's what we normally call an out-of-body experience, where a person feels like they're watching things happen to them, but not actually experiencing them. Dissociation can also occur through derealization. And what that means is this consistent and persistent belief that they are not real, that other people are not real, that what happened to them is not real. Reality has been so broken for these people that it's so difficult for them to actually make coherent sense of it. Finally, we see dissociation with the cases of fragmented or suppressed memories. It's incredibly common for people who have experienced trauma to struggle to piece together a narrative sequence of events and to fill in the gaps to figure out, quote, what really happened. That is just a feature of trauma. The other category of symptoms we see are emotional symptoms, such as, for example, anhedonia, which is a fancy way of saying trouble experiencing pleasant emotions. The things they used to enjoy, they no longer enjoy. The whole world feels gray and like a giant wet blanket has been placed over it. Now, that's coming at it from the suppression of emotion angle. We also see the elevation or exacerbation of emotion angle in the cases of irritability and anger or increased aggression, or perhaps chronic anxiety or fear. The final category of symptoms that we see with trauma are arousal symptoms. Now, I don't mean anything particularly adult by that term. Arousal just means physiological arousal. The body itself is activated. That's another word that I prefer to use a lot of times for some of my clients. We see this in the case of sleep disturbances or hypervigilance, where a person feels like their radar is always on. They're always scanning for trouble, scanning for threat, scanning for problems at all times. They're hyper aroused. We also see this in the case of problems with concentration and memory. Largely because of the arousal, the body and the mind are so overwhelmed with so many stimuli screaming for attention, it's impossible to really focus very well. Many of the people who I work with who have experienced trauma also experience an exaggerated startle response. Not even necessarily about associations with the trauma, just simply loud noises. One of the things I have to be careful of is my office is around a corner. When I come out into the lobby, for a lot of my clients, I tend to make some soft noises before I emerge because I have seen several of my clients react with a somatic startle if I don't do that. All of these symptoms are categories that we see in the cases of trauma: intrusion, dissociation, emotion, and arousal. Now, all bad experiences cause some degree of these things. In order to say with confidence that this is trauma, we have to have multiple of those symptoms. And those symptoms have to persist outside of the trauma context, not only locally in terms of the location and the people, but also temporally, persist for a period of time. And ultimately, it goes back to those three qualities that I mentioned above: intensity, frequency, and duration. That's what separates bad experiences from trauma. But all of this has only been describing what happens. It's not been describing how it happens. So how does trauma actually happen within the psychosomatic person? It is because trauma is fundamentally a learning experience. There is an initial response to environmental stimuli that is perceived as adaptive, either because it seems to work in the moment or because it is seen as likely to work. And then that response gets reinforced through repetition. As we always say in the neuroscience world, neurons that fire together wire together. And that neuronal reinforcement creates a systemic response within the person to all associated stimuli. That systemic response is something that we call a feedback loop. Now, you'll see a graphic right above here. So I want you to track with me as I explain this, using this graphic. This is something I do for my clients all the time. We love to illustrate things on the whiteboard. So now I get to share that with you. The first thing we have are an encounter with stimuli. Those are just the bare facts of the situation, the raw sensory data coming into ourselves. Now, that on its own doesn't mean or cause anything. Meaning is not carried by the event itself. Meaning is carried by our interpretation of the event. And the problem with that is that our interpretation is not really something that we actively, consciously choose. That interpretation that we develop is coded in a much deeper brain structure than the prefrontal cortex. And that deep wiring is what causes the reaction. That reaction to the stimuli is autonomic and instinctual. This is not our higher thinking brain that can evaluate, decide, delay gratification, and the like. This is the operating system working in the background of the person. This is not a program or an app that is opened. It is something that is based off of perception and past experience, as well as their continuing practice with responding to those experiences. It's a default and unthinking reaction. In theological terms, this is what is known as the passions, because these reactions make us passive. They happen to us. They are not something that we make happen. What we make happen is the next step. the response. This is the moment of choice. This is when we choose what to do with our reactions. Do we follow them or reject them? Do we seek to limit them or do we give them free rein? Do we sit with them or do we just ignore or distract or numb from them? And all of that feeds back into the experiential databanks, and that either reinforces or weakens our beliefs about ourselves, other people, and the world. And that also either solidifies the old wiring or it works to build new wiring. That building of new wiring is a concept that we call neuroplasticity. All of our experiences become part of our psychosomatic matrix, those we choose to happen to us and those we don't choose. This is really important to remember. That process of neuroplasticity is non-rational. I say non-rational rather than irrational because irrational makes it sound like it doesn't make sense. That's not always the case. Sometimes it does. The problem is that it is non-rational. It wires itself without any regard to rationality or reason. That process of neuroplasticity has nothing to do with if a thing makes sense or not, or if it's unhealthy or healthy. It even has little to do with if it causes pleasure or pain. Ultimately, that neuroplasticity is wired for survival. Does it increase the chances of the organism's survival? And even that assessment is itself non-rational. Now, all of that gives us both good news and bad news. Let's go with the bad news first. The bad news is that unhelpful responses to trauma reactions only serve to reinforce and re-traumatize. When we respond out of a survival or threat perception, then the stimuli is reinforced as actually being a survival level threat. The trauma reaction is solidified and crystallized as absolutely necessary, and therefore it continues. Now, the good news about this is that neuroplasticity continues throughout the lifespan. It is not the case that there are fewer neurons as we get older. Now, of course, degeneracy and dementia are different events, but simply growing older does not decrease our number of neurons. In fact, neuroplasticity isn't about number of neurons at all. It's about connections between neurons. What makes change harder for us old dogs is the depth of the grooves that we make in our brain, because we have a lot of time to practice that. So because of that, first we have to climb out of one canyon and then dig a new one. We can always learn new response patterns. It will be a lengthy and slow path, but if we walk it often enough, it will flatten out. First into a cart path, and then into a road, and finally into a superhighway. And the best news of all is that as we do this work, it actually does double duty. What I mean by that is that the process of growing new neuronal connections simultaneously prunes old connections. Because our brains and our psyche have a finite space and capacity, unused pathways lie dormant. And then when that happens, behaviors associated with those pathways and reactions associated with those pathways are eventually extinguished. The point of all of this is to say, we are never at the mercy of our past or our present. We can always choose a new future. Now, we cannot snap our fingers and make it new tomorrow, but we can walk a path or a way, or in Hebrew, a halach, to a new destination. No matter what has happened to us, we still have the power to happen to ourselves. The choice of others may have gotten us into this mess. We can get ourselves out of the same mess by refusing to pick up the weapons of the abusers, by going AWOL from the conscription into trauma's army that they have drafted us into. And so now, our final task is, having defined trauma, to be able to talk about the types of trauma. The first type is acute versus chronic trauma. Acute is situational and immediate, a single traumatic event like a car crash. It tends to be tied more to very specific stimuli and situations, whereas chronic trauma is widespread and diffuse, with a long-term pattern of trauma reactions that are very often initiated by a long-term pattern themselves. For example, childhood trauma. There also is complex trauma, which has multiple traumas piling one on top of another across the lifespan. Usually those traumas are each of a different kind, and they wind up causing amplifying and exacerbating effects in all four F's of the survival response: fight, flight, flop or freeze, and fawn. In the case of fight, people chronically raging. In the case of flight, people chronically avoiding. In the case of freeze or flop, people chronically shutting down. And in the case of fawn, people chronically pleasing, no matter what the cost. An example is where a child might lose a parent at a young age due to death or divorce, and then later on be sexually abused by a guardian or a friend, and from there go to military service in a war zone. Each one of those events are going to create compounding traumas. There are a few further types of trauma that we need to consider. One is collective trauma, where a community or a group of people, because of their shared experience as being a part of that group, experience trauma. And the trauma they experience is not about the individual experiencing the specific event. Very often it's about people watching it happen or hearing about it happening, and then wondering when or if it will happen to them. Some of the examples that we see in our current world are things like September 11th of 2001, or the Israelis after October 7th. And I know I've said it several times, but I do want to reiterate it again here. Trauma is not just about the event itself. Trauma is also about the response to the event. In addition to collective trauma, there is also secondary or vicarious trauma. Now, that differs from collective trauma because collective trauma is a type of secondary trauma. Secondary trauma can happen to anyone. They don't necessarily need to be part of an identified group. It can happen simply by witnessing an event or just by being soaked in and surrounded by a chronic trauma in your life, even if the person is not directly traumatized by the event. Here's an example. First responders, police, fire, EMT. They continually witness horrific events, and their job is to be a part of the response and recovery or rebuild. Very frequently, that causes secondary or vicarious trauma. Another example are people who are caretakers or helpers, such as therapists or teachers or children with aging parents. All of these are categories of people who might be experiencing secondary or vicarious trauma. There also is a category of trauma called generational trauma, where people carry the memory of past generations. Now, this is an existential memory, not an experiential memory. And that memory is passed down through epigenetics. There is a recent study on families from the Syrian civil war that spanned several decades, where they witnessed the effects of those traumatic events were felt even on the grandchildren, even after the families had left the conflict zone and were now in a safe zone. Now, it doesn't change their DNA, but it does change some of the chemicals that activate certain genes within their DNA. Now, of course, that is one way in which generational trauma is transmitted. It is also passed down through stories and community histories, also learned experiences such as attachment wounds or maladaptive coping mechanisms. The core feature there is that what happens to one of us happens to all of us. Now, I can hear some of you expressing your skepticism. I'm going to remind you, there is scientific evidence of this. And furthermore, it just makes sense because if one generation doesn't receive adequate support and care for their trauma, then the sons will bear the burden of the fathers. And that is why good mental health care is so important, because generations later will suffer the consequences. And while it won't seem as real on the outside, because, hey, you're safe now, things are better now, it will nevertheless be very real on the inside. So a couple of examples of this are, of course, the experience of African Americans and the history of slavery and civil rights, as well as the ongoing systemic racism that is the heritage of those issues. Or, to take a different example, people who grew up in the Depression. They learned an awful lot about the world during that time. And then they pass on those sensitivities and fears and defense mechanisms and values and beliefs onto the next generation. That is absolutely a way in which trauma survives across generations. The final category we're going to take a look at here is moral injury. This is trauma that occurs at the level of one's deepest values and beliefs. This occurs when one is placed in a situation that causes irreconcilable conflict. To go in either direction would be to betray and deny a part of yourself. This is a situation where your morals and values are leveraged against you. This is the category into which spiritual trauma and religious abuse falls. But moral injury doesn't have to be just about theology. It can also be about the things in your life that you hold most dear. A couple of examples of this are something like a Sophie's choice, either because a person has thrust that impossible choice on you or because circumstances have thrust themselves upon you. Another example is how some people realize that they have become complicit in a system or a corporation or a family or a church that has caused trauma and has caused harm. However, through deception or lack of transparency or having the evil hidden, those things are then revealed as being contrary to their values. That absolutely is a case of moral injury and is a kind of trauma, provided that it has all the effects we have already discussed. I want to end this episode today talking about church hurt, because that is, after all, why we're all here. Here again, I have a graphic to offer. Think of church hurt as a larger umbrella, and then underneath it is a spectrum of harm being done, all the way from toxic theologies all the way up to cults. Every single one of these examples cause harm. Now, the degree of harm is determined by the severity and pervasiveness of the hurt, and the efficacy of the attempts to question or to challenge the hurt, or the depth to which the hurt was assimilated, or just simply, as we've seen, the resources of the individual. And of course, one of those resources is community. And that's where church hurt becomes so extremely confusing. Because if this community both hurts you and helps you, if God is both the source of life and the source of incredible moral injury, that causes a deadly, deep wound. As I shared on the Facebook group, spiritual trauma is someone giving you an inner critic and telling you that it's the voice of God. The effect of that is the starvation of souls, because it weaponizes the food which a soul needs to survive: faith, hope, and love. It poisons the well of living water, and people never want to go back for fear that it will sicken them again. Now, frankly, that makes sense, given their experience. And us coming in with reason and rationality can be helpful at the end of the chain. It does no good to come and tell them that you realize it wasn't really God that hurt you, because it was the name bearers of God. It was the images of God. And I want to offer to all of my fellow believers, we really need to get in the habit of allowing people who have experienced church hurt to wander in the desert for a while, to grumble and cry out until they are brought to the foot of the mountain of God, wherever they may find that, until holy ground is once again sacred and no longer defiled. And that requires a period of purgation and purification, the burning away of what is of this world to transfigure it into a pleasing aroma, and then to toss the rest of the refuse on the ash heap outside the camp. So please, I admonish and encourage you, be gracious and patient with deconstruction. It can be the means of making an acceptable sacrifice and purifying holy space for the presence to reclaim its dwelling place in that person. And that's where I'll leave you today. On YouTube and X, you can find me at ChurchKidPod. And on Facebook, you can join the discussion in our discussion group, Trauma Informed Church Kids. Please, if you like this content, hit the like button and/or subscribe to whatever platform you listen to. The biggest request I would make is for you to rate and/or review the podcast on your platform. This and sharing the podcast are the two best ways to get the word out and get visibility on the interwebs. Finally, just one last word to everyone. I don't know your story, but I know the one who was walking with you in your story. I know that he loves you. He made you for a purpose, and that his plan for you is always better. If you have been hurt by the church, I am sorry for the ways in which we have borne the name in vain. That is our responsibility to repair and repent. I hope that this podcast starts you on your own journey to find resurrection on the other side of deconstruction. My prayer for you is the words of St. Paul to the Ephesians. I ask God that you may know the love of Christ, which is more than we can ever know. I ask that you may be filled with everything that God has. See you next time.